Thank you, Krista. Welcome, everyone. We're here today. We'll be following up on Commissioner O'Reilly's remarks a little bit. With just over a year to go until the World Radio Communication Conference, this panel is bringing together policy experts to discuss spectrum and 5G developments and implications for the global stage in advance of the conference in 2019. So with that, we've heard a lot already this week about developments in the U.S. and what we're doing to become 5G ready as quickly as possible. And today we're going to focus on that a little bit, but also shift and talk about that in the context of what the rest of the world is doing to get ready for 5G. So I just was hoping to start out a little bit with Jayne Stancavage, who is Director of Communications Policy at Intel, and we have Godfrey, who's Senior Vice President of Public Policy at Samsung Electronics America. Hoping to start out with you guys about some of your company's 5G-related announcements before we then shift over to our last panelist, who is Julie Knapp, Chief Engineer of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC.
I should call you first.
So Jayne and John, I'll let you guys decide who wants to start here, but I can barely keep up with all of the 5G-related announcements because everything is ramping up so quickly. So what's on the horizon for Intel and Samsung in terms of 5G? Any recent successes or trials you want to talk about?
Well, actually, John and I met again yesterday, and we were talking about how long we knew each other. And when I first started at Intel, we were known for Intel Inside PCs and laptops. And it's been an amazing transformation. Now, when we talk about Intel Inside, we're inside cell phones, base stations, really driving the network, edge computing, driving the network transformation from end to end. And what we've done is we've built on our momentum from LTE and moving that into 5G. And now to truly be inside in the middle of this, it's a great opportunity. And as we look forward in terms of some of the trials, it's across a lot of different industries. You see that throughout the conference here. It really is. It's everything from just a phone call, but also it's industrial automation, it's smart agriculture, it's the U.S. Open working with AT&T and Fox Sports and Ericsson to actually deliver a truly 4K video experience to the users in a way that's never been done before using 28 gigahertz. So it really is quite exciting, and despite showing my age, it's a great time to be working on 5G.
Good. So Jen, this has been an exciting week for Samsung. 5G is a real opportunity, maybe a once-in-a-decade opportunity for Samsung, and we think it's going to be transformative for us. As you all know, Samsung's a pretty diverse company. We have been number one in television for a long time, number one in mobile phones, number one in semiconductors, number one in brand and home appliance in the United States. And we are fast growing in the network equipment business. And 5G is a real opportunity for that area. For us, what 5G means, along with IoT and artificial intelligence and cloud computing, they all work together, is transformation of people's lives into, from a series of discrete, disconnected experiences. You're watching TV, or you're on your phone, or you're in the kitchen, or you're at work, or you're outside, to a much more seamlessly integrated experience where your world adapts to you and follows you everywhere you go. And the enterprise environment can be transformed similarly. 5G is, through the data rates, through the low latency, and through the device massive density, going to enable all of those kinds of transformations. So we're betting big on it. And we're working with all the US carriers, but this week we're very excited that Sprint has announced that our 2.5 gigahertz massive MIMO solutions are now live on their networks, and our LTE 5G hybrid and 5G upgradable. That Verizon announced the date when they're turning on their 5G home service, which is going to be really fast broadband to your house, and Samsung is one of the suppliers of equipment to Verizon. And AT&T announced that we will be one of their 5G equipment suppliers as well, and also their sole source, at least so far, for CBRS equipment. And AT&T is looking to use that initially with LTE, but upgrade to 5G. So a lot of excitement this week.
Thanks for that update. I hope all of you have had a chance to visit the show floor, and it's exciting to see some of those things that you guys have been talking about in action out there. So we're excited to see all of that for sure. So can you follow up on that, John? Do you have any insights on what's happening in South Korea to facilitate 5G, just with your company's focus there?
Oh, sure, yeah. So, looking at it from an international perspective, both the U.S. and South Korea went into 5G aggressively and with a spirit of innovation. And so even though, the last ITU World Radio Conference did not allocate the 28 gigahertz band for mobile, both the U.S. and South Korea went ahead and did it. And in South Korea this year, in February at the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, there was a lot of 5G going on, a lot of demos. Intel was very involved in that, as well as Samsung and some others. And so a lot of trials to show what 5G could be. But in June, they took a big step, even maybe ahead of the FCC, and have now auctioned off the 28 gigahertz band and the 3.5 gigahertz band for, which will be for 5G. 2,400 megahertz of spectrum at the 28 gigahertz band and 280 megahertz of spectrum at the 3.5 gigahertz band. So it's greatly increasing the amount of commercial mobile spectrum in South Korea. And the Korean Ministry of Communications and Ministry of Science are working on developing vertical industrial applications of 5G and working with industry to really bring it about. So it's an exciting time over there.
Thanks for setting the stage on that. So, at CTIA, we focused a lot on leadership and wireless and the benefits of leading in 4G that came to the United States because of that leadership. So today, the wireless industry adds $475 billion to the United States economy every year and supports 4.7 million jobs. And we're excited about the 5G opportunity in the United States as well as across the world, with the industry projected to invest $275 billion to deploy next-generation networks, resulting in 3 million new jobs and $500 billion in economic growth. So with that, we focused on making sure the United States has the right policies in place to support deployment of 5G as quickly as possible. So Julia, I was hoping you could provide an update on some of the things that the FCC is doing to make sure that we're ready to deploy here in the United States as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Jen. Some of you are probably looking and saying, that's not Tom Sullivan. Tom Sullivan's the chief of our International Bureau, and he sends his regrets he wasn't able to make it. But I do a lot of work, my office does a lot of work with the International Bureau. Tom's shop is on the front lines in helping to prepare for the WRCs and so forth, and he's got the lead role in dealing with satellites and so forth. But a lot of the questions that come up are technical. And in the engineering office, we support Tom relative to the engineering. And actually, following the World Radio Conferences, we prepare the rulemakings that implement the decisions, working with the other bureaus and offices. So let me just get back to the question a bit. Sometimes I think if by now, if you hear low, mid, high, you should all be able to recite the bands. But, we've moved along pretty aggressively in allocating spectrum, preparing the service rules. The one thing I would, we've got auctions that are scheduled. And the one thing, and I mentioned this yesterday, that gets lost is we had incumbent licensees, and we modified the licenses to allow them to deploy mobile now. So the deployments don't have to wait for the auctions and so forth to be done, because a lot of that is overlay and filling in places where we didn't have licenses issued. So So we're moving along there. And I just, to highlight also what Commissioner O'Reilly said, key for us is flexibility. And I think when you go out on the show floor and see the variety of ideas and approaches and so forth, and the bands that they want to do, that's what it's all about. It's about encouraging innovation, that people don't have to come back to the FCC to get approval for their ideas. So we feel pretty good that we're moving ahead. We certainly haven't done completed everything we want to do. We've got an aggressive plan, I think, going forward to complete some of the actions that we've started, but we feel like we're in pretty good shape and more to come.
Thank you for that. So, we're focusing on the U.S. As far as what you're talking about, but John and Jayne, putting that into perspective with the fact that you both work at global companies serving a global market, how do the actions that the FCC is taking and their approach to those issues work to enable large-scale deployments?
Should I close my ears?
First, Julie, you're absolutely right. South Korea, maybe they've done an auction, but they haven't deployed commercially yet, and the U.S. has, and so the U.S. is doing great, and that is thanks to the actions the FCC took. But worldwide, what matters most is getting the networks deployed, and that requires two things: spectrum, and then actually building the networks. And the FCC work on spectrum is essential to make sure that there's places to build. And then, not really the main topic of this panel, but the FCC is also playing a leading role in making sure that the site deployment regulations, both the permitting and the fees, are streamlined and reasonable and most of all predictable. And so that will be very, very helpful in getting the networks built. Why do we care? I mean, because we're eager to see what comes from the building of 5G. There's a promised land out there of applications and services that we can't even imagine yet. And the faster the networks get built, the faster we're going to be able to see what lies in that promised land.
And I can't echo that enough. It really is crucial to enable the large-scale deployments, and the policies that the FCC are taking, some of the activities we see on the Hill as well. It really is important to make sure that we have large-scale network deployments. And what John was just saying about, we don't know what's coming, but the promised land is there. We could not have envisioned many of the applications we use every day now on our 4G networks. That innovation happened because we had very rapid rollout of 4G networks. And if you look at 5G, it offers that opportunity across a large variety of industries. And I can't wait to see what's going to happen, but it absolutely depends on large-scale deployments in the U.S. as quickly as possible.
Great, thanks for that. So, Julie, you mentioned this, that the FCC is set to begin an auction of, we have 28 gigahertz that's set to begin in November, followed by the 24 gigahertz auction shortly thereafter. And then the spectrum will also very soon be available in the 3.5 gigahertz band. The FCC is looking at repurposing the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, and NTIA is investigating 3.45 gigahertz. So we have a range of spectrum in the pipe, which is great. So, looking to you, I think Jayne or John, how well harmonized are the bands that the U.S. has made available for 5G or is continuing to consider with the approaches that other countries across the globe are taking? Where is there overlap, and where does the U.S. diverge in some places? I know John mentioned 28 gigahertz a little bit, but.
Yeah, so I'll go first, and then John can add in.
Because she's the expert in this area.
So what we see internationally is basically there's three types of ranges that you look for 5G: low, mid, and high bands. The U.S. has certainly been very aggressive in terms of low band rollout and millimeter wave, the high band, and we appreciate that. And of course, we're focusing on the mid-band as well now, because it's very important to have all three if you really want to enable all the different types of applications that 5G promises. And when we look internationally, we do see low-band rollouts happening as well. A lot of emphasis in many of the leading countries on mid-band spectrum. John mentioned that Korea has already auctioned off the 3.5 gigahertz band in June of this year. We see that in other countries as well. It's very important to get that spectrum because it does offer some applications that can't be done on other frequency ranges. And of course, the millimeter wave bands, what you see is, and I think we'll get into this a little later in the panel, but the important part as you get into the higher bands is to make sure that the user equipment is going to be able to support it. And so you'll see Europe, for example, is looking at 26 gigahertz, some other countries as well. The US, Korea, Japan have looked at 28. And when you see that, that all can be supported on one radio tuning range. And then again, we see the same sort of thing, for example, at 37 to 40 gigahertz in the United States. Other countries are looking just above that at 40.5 to 43, for example. And it's very important because then we still get all of the benefits of economies of scale. So we don't have the exact same harmonization, but we're getting the benefits in terms of roaming and economies of scale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. As long as the international harmonization is within tuning range on the same equipment, you can get the economies of scale. And I would also add that global harmonization helps allocate engineering resources just to invent the technology, especially in the millimeter wave bands, which have not really been used for mobility until now. There's a lot of fundamental work still being done. I mean, it's been going on for maybe the last 5 to 7 years, but there's a lot of cutting-edge engineering that has to go on, and you really want to target that towards the bands that are going to be used in as much of the world as possible.
Right. So the FCC's recent item on spectrum frontiers that the comment cycle is open on right now is looking at making that 26 gigahertz band available for flexible terrestrial use. So John, what are your thoughts on that proceeding and the global harmonization of that band?
Yeah, well, we fully support it. I think we're on record as fully supporting what the FCC is doing in that band. And as Jayne was saying, 26 and 28 gigahertz are close enough together that you can actually reuse a lot of the technology investment. I would also say, in terms of the international harmonization with the ITU work coming up, the U.S. must go to that work advocating in support of that 26 gigahertz allocation in the ITU. And when you do, tell the story of the U.S. 28 gigahertz deployment. We were unsuccessful. The U.S. was unsuccessful in the last work in persuading the ITU to move ahead with 28 gigahertz. But that doesn't mean at the next work you got to be shy about it. We need to talk about the great success that is happening in the United States in that band and how it creates momentum for the rest of the world to move ahead at 26. It's still close enough to be harmonized. It also proves the viability and the usefulness of those millimeter wave bands. So I really look forward to the U.S. position at the next work.
Maybe I'll just chime in a little bit. So I think harmonization is a worthy objective. And I don't think this is just true of the United States, but around the world, we each have different incumbencies. And often when we talk about the harmonization, we're all looking at, well, what have we got in those bands? And are we able to protect them? So I think we've been making efforts across the board to try to align. At 28, we looked at, well, if the rest of the world went to 26, not that far apart, we can have one radio that potentially could operate in any of those parts of bands. And we have 26 that we teed up in the proceeding. There are incumbencies there on the federal side is to work through. And when you look at the mid-band spectrum, and we have the Citizens Broadband Radio Service kind of in the middle, and we're looking at this piece at 3700 to 4200, the satellite C-band. But there as well, we have to be mindful of the incumbencies. Sometimes you just wish you'd be able to move the pieces around on the board. No, it would be so easy. But often I think the services appreciate when they are an incumbent the need to work through the issues. And they're hard, but we're tackling them as well. So we've teed up ways to free up spectrum there as well. I think it is a bold move as well on the federal government side to be, with Congress support, to study the spectrum below. So we're looking at the same ranges. Whether, in the end we have the same kinds of regulatory structures remains to be seen, but we're trying to align there as well. And when you look at some of the upper bands too, whether it's 37 or 39 gigahertz, there's far more alignment than difference.
Yeah. So circling back on the tuning range, why are we talking about tuning ranges now? Why is that something that's possible in some of these millimeter wave bands in a way that wasn't possible with some of the other bands that we've been using, at least here in the U.S.?
So it can help solve some problems in terms of equipment design. I think, for the engineers, ideally you'd like to all have it be exactly the same. But the technology has got enough flexibility now that when we can't exactly align, maybe close is good enough. I remember going back to the early days on wireless when, could you have a dual band radio at 800 megahertz and 1.9? And not that it's a terrific thing to have more than 40 band classes now, but there are things being done in the radios, partly because of software-defined radio technology and the way the radios are designed to give you a lot more flexibility. Mm-hmm. So, rather than taking an approach that says, well, we could get at the spectrum, but it's going to take us 5, 6, 7, 8 years to do it, if we've got spectrum that we can open up quickly mm-hmm. and then deal with the alignments either by considering, can we allocate that same spectrum, or can the radios be designed so that they can cope with the differences?
Okay. If I could just add on one crucial piece. When we were in the lower bands, the very lowest bands, you actually use a different type of duplexing. And what it really means for the user is, for us to develop a device for you, it needs a different hardware duplexer, which you don't know about in your phone, you don't care about in your phone. But as we move into the higher bands, we use a different type of duplexing. And what that means is that same phone will work whether you're in South Korea, the United States, Europe, Japan, China, Brazil. It will still work. It will only work on the frequencies the regulators allow in that country, but it provides the flexibility that Commissioner O'Reilly and Julie were talking about, because we do realize there are different incumbents, there are different national priorities, and things that you have to move around like pieces on a chessboard. And it's just the way that the technology works in these higher bands that allows that flexibility. But as we come into the work 19, we do have to think about that, because it's a crucial piece in terms of really enabling 5G worldwide.
Absolutely. So I think we will circle back on that in probably just a few minutes. But I want to touch on one other thing you said, Julie. You talked a little bit about, when the FCC is looking at making spectrum available and taking into consideration incumbents, but so maybe you could walk through a little bit, in a little bit more detail, what the FCC looks at when they're looking at making spectrum available for licensed terrestrial use. What are some of the considerations you have to look at, and what are the ththings that drive decision making?
So as I thought about this and I started to write down things, it's like, gee, the list was getting long. but there are any number of factors, and I'll just rattle off a few. One are, you look at the incumbencies, and ideally maybe you start out saying, well, can we make this exclusive use spectrum? Can we move out of service and make that clear? That's always, I think, the first thing you look at. But then you say, well, gee, that service is needed. There isn't another spot to put it. So you start looking at sharing. Is the sharing going to provide value? If I got a service that's deployed across the entire country and there's no way to share, writing down on the paper that we're going to share it and you can use it in a few isolated places doesn't give you a lot of value. So you look at, how could you share, what approaches could you use? The bandwidth. Generally the technologies today are looking for wider bands. So there's not as much value in identifying something that's 5 megahertz as opposed to we can get 50 megahertz. Then you've got to look at things like the adjacencies. It's like, great, we can give you the spectrum, but you're going to be sitting next to gigawatt radars. And you say, gee, I'm never going to be able to operate there because that service is going to blow us away. You look at proximity to other bands. One of the reasons I think AWS-3 was so successful, aside from the great work NTIA and industry did in identifying how that spectrum would be cleared and planned and so forth, is it sat right next to the existing spectrum that what we used to call PCS. Or AWS-1 actually, and you could just expand. You didn't need to put out new towers. You could just expand what you had there. So that became enormously of value. So as I mentioned at the start, there's lots of factors. There's probably more. The international harmonization certainly weighs into it. That carries a lot of weight, and we're looking here in the United States. Well, can that work for us?
Mm-hmm. Great. And then circling, I think Jayne you mentioned this a little bit. Just wanted to focus a little bit on mid-band spectrum and why that's so important. We're probably spending a lot of time talking about spectrum frontiers and millimeter wave and 5G, but want to make sure that mid-band and 3.5, 3.7 don't get lost in the discussion here.
I can promise you that it's not lost in the discussion at my company. We are spending a lot of time on it. It really is important in terms of, the low band, you have pretty nice coverage area. The high band has great bandwidth, a lot of potential there. But you do need sort of this Goldilocks spectrum in the middle that sort of has some attributes of both. You have wider channels, because it is true what Julie just said, you need the wider channels for a lot of the services, but it also has a greater coverage area. And so mid-band is sort of a Goldilocks piece of spectrum that's absolutely crucial to enable a lot of the different 5G usage scenarios. And we're really trying to think outside the box and coming up with a solution that could allow that spectrum to be made available in the US as quickly as possible, enough spectrum to really enable the types of services we think we need to see.
Yep, and in that band, the CBRS is especially interesting spectrum, the place where we're going to be working with AT&T, because it's going to be a proving ground for the business model around sharing, dynamic sharing based on a database. I think the TV white space band hasn't been used as much as CBRS is going to be used. And people are waiting for the shared access database to be up and running. The sooner the better. I know a lot of parties are working together to try and complete the evaluation of how that database operates. But assuming the database works perfectly, then the interesting part will be finding out how the sharing works, because it's not an unlicensed band. You have to get permission from the database. Even if you're in the generalized access, the GAA, it's still, you need to get permission from the database. And then we've layered on the priority access, which is subject to auctions, and then there are the incumbents. And so, it couldn't be a lot more complicated, but we're taking advantage of technology and data connectivity that's available today that wasn't available 20 years ago. It's a tool in your toolbox, and the FCC is really being an innovator in comparison to the rest of the world in showing how this can work. So we're excited to get going.
Maybe I can just chime
Sure.
in on this. I think here in the United States, we've had a history of making bold moves on trying out new spectrum models. Whether it was, if you go back to when auctions started, the rest of the world, we were like the first. And the rest of the world looked at it and said, well, let's see how that goes. Once it went well, that's a good idea, and it spread. And as you look through the years, the whole idea of flexibility started to catch hold. When we applied flexibility to commercial wireless and other parts of the world, they identified the 2G band and the 3G band, and then had problems later on in trying to do the upgrades it carried forth. So on dynamic spectrum access, I think this is a model that people around the world are looking. Usually the first reaction is, we'll see how that goes. It doesn't look like right until it's successful. And it's not that we're trying to make it more complicated. What we're trying to do is how can we find techniques to get us more access to spectrum quickly and solve problems where, we couldn't move what was there to another band, like the Navy radars. So I think we're pretty proud of the approaches that we've taken.
Great. I know we're all looking forward to seeing that spectrum become available as quickly as possible, and excited that should be soon, hopefully. So I think, the elephant in the room, we've circled around it a fair amount. It's not, don't worry, I'm not tricking you. But Commissioner O'Reilly talked about the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. We've mentioned the World Radio Conference, Radio Communication Conference a fair amount up here. But let's start with the basics. For anyone in the room who maybe is following domestic policy a little bit more closely, just let's start with the basics of what is the conference and why does it matter? How does it compare to what the FCC is doing, and how does it impact, what we're able to do and what other countries are able to do? I don't know who wants to take that one first, but.
So I'll take a first stab. Sometimes I think it's a conference created for spectrum wonks. But starting with, the allocations table. The master table is an international table. It divides the world into different regions. I think it sets the stage for harmonization, which encourages investment. It's particularly important, I think, for all services, but for example, satellite services that have to operate around the world, they need consistent spectrum. So, but it's not only that. It gets into things like what the interference protection levels are for existing services, what the power limits might be. And so you really have to pay attention, because it may not only be, here's the band, there's so much focus on this issue 1.13, what the spectrum is going to be for IMT. But you got to pay attention to all the rest, because in some of those bands, there's other services that are being looked at, and the allocations make a difference, and what the protection levels are make a difference in what you can do. So after the WRC, what comes out of that is a set of the final acts of the WRC. And on the allocation side, that goes through a process, usually takes at least 6 months before they're published. Then on the allocation side, it goes through a process on the federal government side, sorting through all of the fine details, changes and footnotes to the table. Then the NTIA makes recommendations to the commission. And in many cases, these are just administrative changes that we can implement. In others, they're substantive. And then so we have to conduct a rulemaking on any changes. So it's all, plays a critical role in creating the allocations for new services and the things that affect them, like what the protections have to be for other services. So it really is important. And it goes on cycle about every 3 years. Lots of big issues on this upcoming one.
Yeah, just one other, I think, crucial point. It's an international treaty level conference. And so basically you spend 4 weeks basically locked in a set of rooms, all different services, sort of looking at pieces that affect them both in terms of access to new spectrum, but then also potentially operating in spectrum they operate in. So you do have to pay attention to a lot of different issues. But you spend 4 weeks, and I know some people have some issues that apparently are less controversial and they get to sort of relax after the second week. I'm confident that ours will be resolved the last Wednesday night of the conference between 2 and 5 a.m.
Well, as Commissioner O'Reilly was saying, a lot of the, not all, I mean, it's an inherently hard problem to allocate spectrum internationally, but a lot of the problems do arise from differences in political philosophy among the different countries. And the United States does things in a more flexible way. You know, the FCC is not allocating spectrum for 5G. The FCC is allocating spectrum for flexible use, and not all the other ITU members operate that way. It's one of the reasons we have so much investment in innovation. And, you know, the 28 gigahertz band is a band that was originally tried, you know, several other businesses have been tried there. The U.S. is flexible enough to add a mobile allocation and try something new, which now, you know, has a really good chance of working.
Well, you don't think getting close to 200 countries in a room for 4 weeks to try to convince them of a flexible approach is problematic?
I'm sure Commissioner O'Reilly can convince them.
Well, one of the things that happens behind the scenes, there's all sorts of preparation leading up to that, but the excitement always comes, just as Jayne said, in those last couple of days, and we've got a home team back here who supports our folks who are on the scene there, and you'll get a panic call at the 11th hour. Somebody just came up with this brand new idea, or the topics for the next WRC coming up, and we, like everybody else around the world, weigh, you know, is this something that we can support or not?
Julie, you're welcome to come with us.
Yeah. Somebody has to stay behind. Right.
Jayne, can you talk a little bit about the mobile industry goals for this upcoming conference? Which items and issues are you most focused on?
So as Julie alluded to, you have to pay attention to 113 is obviously a big one. Agenda item 113 is looking at spectrum for IMT 2020. For those of you who don't follow ITU language, what we mean is 5G. So we're looking at different millimeter wave bands for that. And obviously, it's going to be very important to make sure from a mobile industry perspective that we do have identifications made within those tuning ranges where we are designing products. It's also going to be important to look at some of the other agenda items that are operating in the same. This conference, we have a number of agenda items that are actually all looking at the same spectrum at the same time. And so to make sure that decisions that are made at the conference are going to still allow that mobile use. And the key piece will be the flexibility, because the conference happens every 4 years, which means if the rules aren't in place at this conference, right, we're talking another 8 years, well, 7 years now, but, sorry, 5 years now, but it's still like a lifetime in terms of the types of what the engineers are doing in the innovation. They can't even, 5 years, we have to guess right. And we have to make sure that the decisions that are made in November of 2019 are going to carry us through until at least November of 2023 and maybe even 2027. So we really need to have flexible and sufficient spectrum made available within the tuning ranges to really enable 5G in the millimeter wave bands.
Yeah, and just building on those tuning ranges, what are some of we've mentioned them in passing, but what are some of the key ones that we're looking at that we think will come out of the conference?
I think the two biggest ones, there are others that are under study in different things in terms of happening with them. The two biggest ones, I think, are the 26 gigahertz range. So that's from 24.25 to 27.5, which is part of that extended tuning range with the 28 gigahertz products that we already see in the United States, Korea, and Japan.
Or the 24 gigahertz that the FCC is also going to be making available, so you could tune into it from the other side.
And then also the 37 to 43.5. Those are the two with the most momentum, I think. There are other bands under study. We'll see how some of those turn out in terms of moving forward, but those are the two biggest tuning ranges.
Great. So we have a few minutes left here. We can maybe try to cover quickly how the U.S. comes up with its positions. I don't think we'll be able to dive into it too far, but Jayne, you chair one of the FCC's Work 19 advisory committees. So, if you could give us the, 30-second version of what that process is, and then maybe Julie can kind of fill us in on what happens from there.
Yeah, so I always get to chair, I chair the most controversial group, I think, terrestrial services group. And basically what we do is we have discussions and we come up as an industry with proposals. Hopefully they are consensus where we're able to send a recommendation to the FCC to look at. In some cases, we have different views among the members of industry, and that we send them two different proposals to say this is what the members of industry think in terms of what should happen on any individual band under an agenda item. And then we turn it over to the FCC for them to figure out what to do with it and continue through the process. And then they send it back out. But Julie will cover the next piece.
I'm glad I don't have to diagram it. Yeah, so you should understand that the positions are negotiated between the FCC, the NTIA, much of the spectrum is shared, and we all have to make all of the pieces work together, along with State Department. And so we have an advisory committee process that tackles through each of these issues to make recommendations to the agency on what they feel a position should be. It's a tremendous resource. It's not always possible to, through that process, to have the different viewpoints be reconciled. And then they'll come to us, and sometimes it's negotiating with NTIA and state, but mostly, when on the technical stuff between FCC and NTIA, to see if we can find a way that we can go forward that balances the different concerns. And it is a process that, it starts early enough. Like a lot of things, it kind of ramps up as you go. There are international elements like CTIA that we try to get on board other parts of the world to positions that we can put more force behind. And it's been, it's not easy. There often are conflicts to be resolved, technical differences and so forth, but it's been going on this way for as long as I can remember. And generally, in the end, I'm always reminded of the song, you may not always get what you want, but you get what you need, from the Rolling Stones.
You promise?
I make no promises. But I think that's the end game that we try to get to.
All right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, maybe because we're running out of time, just a high level, sort of what the process starts with. So we come up with a proposal or multiple proposals. The FCC gets it. As Julie said, they reconcile with NTIA and State Department, and then we have a U.S. position that goes into CTIA. And then we work with all the other administrations in what we call Region 2, or the Americas, to try to come up with a position for our regional group. The Organization of American States, basically, at the conference. There are 5 other groups in the world, regional preparatory groups, that do the same thing. And then, as all of these come up with the proposals, we then have to try to reconcile them at the conference. And that's what the 4-week conference is about. So as Julie said, you want the strongest possible position as a region to go into those negotiations, so we can try to make sure that is the output from the conference as well.
Great. So we're out of time with that. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'll just highlight that if you guys are all back with us next year, I think we'll be just a few days out from the conference, so we can all look forward to that. Thank you.
And you're welcome to join us. It's great fun.
Sharm el Sheikh.
Geneva's lovely. Oh, Sharm el Sheikh. That's right.
Yep.
The next time.
Yep. So thank you to Julie, Jayne, and John. Really appreciate your insights today, and thanks to everyone in the audience as well.
Great.